Okay, so we're going to pick up, this is still chapter 1. This is the third part of chapter 1, and we will pick up from here. Okay, so this is terrorism. It's a conceptual overview. You have to bear with me. In the previous lecture, during the last video, it shuts off and turns back on, so you have to make sure you watch the whole video. Again, this is part 3 of chapter 1, first impressions. Okay, so there are some conceptual considerations in order to understand political violence. Terrorism has a decidedly pejorative meaning at present, so even those who commit extreme acts of political violence will not perceive themselves as terrorists. So again, we get to the argument, is somebody a freedom fighter or a terrorist? And it is definitely a matter of perception. And so terrorists, or acts that are considered terrorist acts, the people that perpetrate them look to become or look to be called freedom fighters in order to avoid the pejorative connotation to their group or their acts. So in the next few slides, we're going to look at the significance of symbolism. Political violence, is it mala prohibita or mala in se, and the just war doctrine. Okay, so we've talked about symbolism before, but terrorists see themselves and their acts and targets as highly symbolic. They are righteous defenders of valued principles, and their acts kill or harm those who represent opposing viewpoints. This is very important. It's a central feature of terrorism, and it's central to the terrorist public relations and propaganda campaigns. Their targets symbolize the righteousness of terrorist causes and the evil of their opponent. And here he includes a couple of cases: Oklahoma City bombing, September 11th, and most recently, the attacks of the on the Boston Marathon, and in France on the newspaper Charlie Hebdo, which was printing writings that were in opposition to Islam. And so these targets, they're very, very symbolic, and the more of a important symbol it is, the more of a target it has become. And certainly, when we worry or when we secure places in New York City, one of the places we secure is the Statue of Liberty. It's always one of the places that we worry about as a target, the Empire State Building. Places like these, they have a very, very significant meaning to us and thus to terrorists. So again, we talked about this before, political violence being mala prohibita or mala in se, and I'll go over it again. Mala prohibita are acts that are crimes that are made illegal by legislation. They're not inherently immoral, wicked, or evil. It could be gambling, prostitution, smoking marijuana, and so forth, things like that. Society has declared the act to be wrong. The acts, mala in se, are acts that are immoral or wrong in and of themselves. They cannot be justified in a civilized society and have no acceptable qualities. And as examples, we have murder, rape, stealing. It's very, to steal from someone, it's never going to be legalized. Stealing will never become legislatively legal. So these are acts that are inherently wrong in and of themselves. That's the difference between mala prohibita and mala in se. Okay, so with political violence and or terrorism, questions of right and wrong are a matter of perspective. So the folks fighting a jihad, they're fighting a holy war. And so from their perspective, they're fighting the infidels, and their cause is the right cause. Here in America, we're fighting a war on terror that was declared after September 11th, and we're fighting against the evil of radical Islam, and that's the perspective, and that's the narrative that we've formed in order to fight against members of the jihadist groups. So who's right and who's wrong depends on whose perspective and where and what side of the table you're sitting on. Again, are you a freedom fighter or are you a terrorist? And the battle for media and the battle for information, um, it's very important. So it's a fight for the hearts and minds of prospective supporters on each side. So when we talk about the war on terror or the holy war or jihad, it's important for both sides to justify the killing of innocent people and the murder of innocents. So the just war doctrine is a doctrine that was developed, and it's an ideal and moralistic philosophy. Just and bellow is correct behavior while waging war, and just ad bellum is correct conditions for waging war in the first place. And so this doctrine is often used conceptually by extremists to justify violence. It's also used by the West to justify going to war against groups or against enemies. So the just war doctrine is a doctrine developed initially by St. Augustine in the 5th century. It establishes the justifications for political violence, why extreme violence can be chosen, what sorts of force can be used in particular situations, and what targets are acceptable. So, if we look back on history at the time the Crusades were being waged, um, and so war is not an uncommon practice to mankind. It's been going on for a very, very long time. And so St. Augustine came up with just and bellum, which are the conditions that are correct for waging war, and what are the correct behaviors during a conflict. Um, what is acceptable to what acceptable behaviors can we use, such as um, prisoners of war? How do we treat them? Uh, Waging the war itself, what kind of weaponry we can use. So these were things that were developed later on, but they became part of the just war doctrine. Okay, so the just war doctrine was traditionally applied to govern instances of interstate conflict, such as World War I or World War II, when different countries in Europe were fighting against each other. More recently, is it applied to those who choose terrorism as dissidents, or as leaders of states. Um, so, certainly after World War One, we had the Geneva Convention because of the methods of warfare that were used by the different countries in World War One, including chemical warfare. And so these different kinds of weapons were outlawed after World War One because they were so heinous and so evil that they said they would never be used again in warfare. More recently, as we see terrorists in Syria and different places are trying to overthrow governments, the just war doctrine has been used for them and applied to them to be used to try to overcome states that are have been um, unfair to Islam, or that just um, these these countries are secular and they want to turn them into sectarian states. The Christian Monitor set forth in the wake of September 11th a moral checklist to guide counter-terrorist strategy. List included considerations focused on just and bellow, such as steps to minimize civilian casualties and the appropriateness of overturning governments that might be aiding and abetting terrorists. And we've seen even recently in recent history where we've carried out bombings in Afghanistan, where innocent civilians have been murdered and killed. And a lot of times we'll see on the news these places will show the innocents to show what's going on, and that's the terrorist organizations are showing them in order to gain um, sympathy to their cause and use it to gain followers to their jihad. So a terrorist might be on his own killing innocent civilians, but they also use that against the West to show that, or to gain sympathy towards their own cause. So, as we're beginning to see, uh, the study of terrorism is a complicated study. It's complicated by many different, many different reasons, including political, religious. Um, but as this book shows, terrorism it's certainly not a new phenomenon. As we read the first chapter, as we read on in the book, um, there is a historical. The author gives some historical perspectives on terrorism, and the current character of terrorism is derived from historical practices. And Mr. Martin talks about antiquity, and he uses several instances of the state committing acts of extreme violence against population. For example, Babylon's exile of the Jews in 598 BC E, before the Common Era, or dissidents committing tyrannicide. And tyrannicide is the assassinating of a tyrant. So he gives 3 or 4 examples in the book of tyrannicide, of mass exile, and of the suppression of dangerous ideas. Okay, so during the Roman age, the empire based in Rome routinely intimidated subjects through institutionalized punitive violence, crucifixion, um, and inflicted massive violence on foes, um, such as the siege and the conquest of Carthage in 146 BC. The Roman Empire, at one part, it was one of the largest empires in history. It encompassed large parts of the world, and the saying at the time was that all roads led to Rome. They also practiced the assassination of emperors, which is known as regicide. It was common. The most famous one was probably the killing of Julius Caesar. So, um, if they didn't like a leader, they would assassinate him to get rid of him. They also, when they took over a area or a land, particularly throughout Europe as they branched out, whoever they overtook and became part of the empire, people were forced into slavery or they were exterminated if they were found to be no use. But slavery was a big part of the empire. The Romans enslaved vast amounts of people that they conquered. Okay, so in the ancient and medieval Middle East at this time, dissident terrorism was not uncommon, and he gives the examples of the Sicarii, were a Jewish rebel faction that attacked the Romans and the Jewish establishment during his time. And the zealots, that's where they were known as zealots, and that's where the term comes from. A zealot, who's somebody that's has strong beliefs about something. Dissident, they employed terrorism, especially assassination, in Roman-controlled Palestine. So as the Romans took over, they had strong armies and they overtook these places, but there were factions that fought against them, and they used terrorist tactics at the time in order to fight back. Again, it's a theme that comes up through time that if you're where the weak attack the strong, and obviously you can't attack them with an army, so terrorism becomes a popular method, or guerrilla warfare, which we'll talk about later on in the course. So during the Dark Ages, Mr. Martin talks about it as being a prelude to modern terrorism. The nation states in Israel, they didn't exist yet. So much of the warfare that went on was between feudal lords, and it was religious, political, but there was no state boundary. So a lot of what went on was uh, terroristic in nature, although it wasn't considered terroristic at the time. And later on, as the nation states evolved, then the warfare became more feudal, and it became more of what we would define as insurgencies or guerrilla warfare, and then what we would call today as terroristic or terrorism. So, leading up to those nation states, the warfare that went on, if a leader or a feudal lord was more powerful, the group that was resisting might use terrorism in order to uh, fight back. So, at the time, because there were no nation states, it wouldn't be considered it wouldn't be the classical case or classically considered terrorism. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the French Revolution. It's a watershed in European oligarchy because the people revolted against the king and queen and overthrew them, and the people gained power. Problem was they began a reign of terror. So after the revolution, the Jacobin Party waged what has been called a reign of terror to arrest, try through a revolutionary tribunal, and execute via the guillotine enemies of the state. Such tribunals were repeated in later contexts, such as in communist China during the People's Struggle, where anti-revolutionaries were accused and forced to confess, and in Iran after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, when Ayatollah Khomeini came into power. So the French Revolution is a very important part um, in terrorism in context, in that that's where the term terror came from. So after the people overthrew the oligarchy, they actually went and terrorized the people who didn't agree with them. Okay, so in the book on page 12, Martin cites two examples from the left of terrorism, and we will talk about them later on because he cites in the book that they're examples of anarchy and Marxism, and we'll talk about both of those terms later on. But he talks about the Luddites in the early 1800s England, who were resisting the Industrial Revolution and began to sabotage machinery and such, feeling that that machinery was going to adversely affect the workforce by taking over jobs. Also, he cites the People's Will was a revolutionary group acting on behalf of the peasants in 1870s Russia. They carried out assassinations in on political figures, including a czar, and it was kind of a precursor to the 1917 Russian Revolution that would follow and bring on Marxism and communism. Okay, so now we get on a little bit on to, in the first chapter, he talks about the modern era and the war on terrorism. So there's a term, the new terrorism, and basically the new terrorism they theorize is cell-based. They use weapons of mass destruction. It's politically vague or religious, asymmetrical, and the use of modern technologies. And we see this today in the recent attacks that we've had. Although they use modern technologies, some of the recent attacks haven't used weapons of mass destruction. They've used traditional weaponry, automatic weapons. So traditionally, terrorism was carried out by clearly identifiable groups. Oftentimes, a group would take credit for an attack, just like recently an attack in Turkey, ISIS took credit for it. Um, and conventional weapons, they use small arms and explosives. Although the new terrorism claims that we're going to see the use of the use of weapons of mass destructions, the traditional weaponry has still been the most common method that terrorists have used. Um, and specifically identifying who is championed by the cause and who is targeted. Obviously, the West and our beliefs are being targeted by ISIS and other groups. So You know, that's traditionally. New terrorism, they argue, instead sees loosely structured networks motivated by sometimes vague abstract ideals, seeking to inflict massive casualties through asymmetrical methods. Um, for example, weapons of mass destruction, and using technology and the media in planning and executing the attacks. Political violence will have a global audience and imposing challenges for those who attempt or attempting to stop such attacks. So, if we look at just current the newspapers and what's going on currently in the world, there's been an attack um, by the Russia by a state attack, possibly on our electoral system. So, if a state can do it, you know, it's possible for a terrorist group to do the same thing and to attack a grid, an electrical grid. And so these are the things that are worrisome to the to countries, and it's been termed the new terrorism. So after September 11th, the term the new terrorism was coined, and people became acutely aware that um, groups were trying to use methods that could cause the most and inflict the highest amount of casualties, such as biological weapons, radiological weapons, dirty weapons, weapons of mass destruction. And so um, this was felt that it was different than previous methods, and that's why in the book he contrasted to the older methods and older groups as opposed to these newer groups. But as we've gone further away from September 11th, many of the recent attacks have involved traditional weaponry, and they've used the traditional weaponry to inflict mass casualties. Not as many as on September 11th, but quite frankly, they've been effective in France and Germany in inflicting mass casualty where many people have been murdered. So in the book, he talks about terrorism and criminal skill, and he has three cases in point. Um, and so, if we judge terrorism to be illegal, then we classify organizations such as Al Qaeda as criminals. We can assess the level of criminal skill employed by individual terrorists. So, Martin uses criminal skill as a uh, measure to see how sophisticated the terrorist group or criminal was, and he picks um, three different people that he uses, three different individuals. One is Anders Breivik, and Breivik killed over 70 people in Oslo, Norway, with a car bomb and handguns. He was a lone wolf, and he disguised himself as a police officer and was able to get on a ferry onto an island where children were being uh, a class group or a camp for children, a summer camp. So it was a low degree of criminal sophistication. Martin argues, self-professed right-wing ideologue acting on his own behalf, not part of an organized group. He was a lone wolf, and he used ammonium nitrate and fuel oil, explosives, a carbine, and a semi-automatic pistol, and he was effective. He murdered approximately 80 people, most of them um, young adults. So it didn't take an extreme amount of skill to effect that terror attack, but he was certainly quite effective. So the second person Martin cites is Ted Kaczynski. He was known as the Unabomber, and from May 1978 till his capture in April 1996, he detonated over 15 bombs, some delivered through the mail in the United States Post Office. He killed three, and he injured over 20. Uh, he exhibited a medium level of criminal skill. Personally, I would argue that in order to create a letter bomb, you need more than a medium level of criminal skill. I believe that you need a little bit more than that. Kaczynski actually happened to be quite a brilliant scientist in his day. Um, but he was not affiliated with any political organization. He carried out his campaign to draw attention to what he considered the dehumanizing effects of technology. And that was in 1996. Imagine now, as we come into, technology is used even more so today than it was in 1996. Everyone has a cell phone. In 1996, not everyone had a cell phone. Um, so he is serving multiple life sentences in a federal prison. Um, he's considered an anarchist in his war against technology. And so um, Martin considers him to be uh, a medium level of criminal sophistication. And again, I would argue that he possibly had a little higher than medium. So, okay, so the third person that Martin cites is Ramzi Youssef. Um, and so he was responsible for what is known as the Bojinka plot, which was to assassinate Pope John Paul II and blow up several jets bound for the U.S. He also was responsible for the 1993 bombing of the first bombing of the World Trade Center. So, having gone through terrorist training camps in Pakistan funded by Osama bin Laden, he was ultimately executed the partly successful truck bombing of Tower 1 of the World Trade Center on February 26, 1993. 6 people were killed and over 1,000 were injured. But the attacks did not bring down the towers that he has planned. But his preparation and his planning revealed a high level of criminal skill. After he uh, blew the truck bomb up, he was able to escape, and he was tied to the global jihad associated with bin Laden and the Al Qaeda organization. He was captured 2 years later after the Trade Center bombing in Pakistan and is serving over 240 years in a federal prison. Um, he is a real deal, I guess you would say, terrorist. He is also the nephew of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is one of the primary, he's considered the primary planner of the September 11th attacks, which later on did, in fact, take down both towers. So, although Yusuf was unable to bring the towers down with his truck bomb, um, several years later, his uncle was successful. So, that pretty much ends chapter one. We'll pick up next week with chapter two. So, um, continue doing the reading and go to the discussion board. We'll have the discussion board. We'll have the questions for you to answer this week. So that's pretty much it. Have a great week.